All right, welcome back to the shop. I see a lot of messages, a lot of questions being asked about removal of front tire. Seems to be a real problem with that. And it can be a real chore getting these front tires off these three-wheelers. You think it wouldn't be that hard, but you know, some simple jobs are some of the worst jobs. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna pull the front tire off of this one. This is an 83 Big Red. It's got a flat tire, it's had a flat tire. It's not dry rotted. I air it up about once a month or so, but we're just gonna go through the steps of taking it off anyway. While it's off, I'll fix it and put it back on. You have two different type of front ends. You have your 8-inch and your 9-inch front end. And we're talking 200 hardtails now, 200cc hardtail bikes. We're not gonna get into the 200X or the 350X. They're almost all the same. I'm just gonna speak in general terms. Your bike may vary a little bit, but almost all of them are the same. So let's take a look at what actually makes up the front tire assembly. You have two different styles. On the early Big Reds, you had a castle nut and the axle goes all the way through, and on this side it's round. It's not even hex like a bolt. On your 8-inch wheels and your other bikes, you have these four 10mm bolts that hold this casting and pinches the axle here. So that's important. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But back to the Big Red. Let's focus on just the Big Red and then we'll talk about the other ones. I always find it's best if you understand how something is put together, then you'll understand how to take it apart. There's two major components that fail on these axles, or that get bound up. Inside this hub here, you're going to have a piece of steel pipe, and that pipe rusts up and rusts to the axle itself. That's one possible problem when taking these apart. A lot of guys have a problem with those. The other problem is when you have a threaded axle that goes into the fork itself. Now here on this 185S, you see the axle comes through the brake housing, it comes all the way through and is actually threaded into the lower part of the fork. This is your other problem area on these front ends. Now the Big Red's not threaded that way, so we don't have to worry about that. But we're going to talk about both of them, and we're going to show you how to get both of them apart. So the first thing you're going to want to do is remove your cotter pin. And I'm going to show you a couple of tricks about how to get these off. Now, first and foremost, I like to take a Phillips screwdriver that will just fit inside this hole on this side. And as you see, this one is all caked up with mud and dirt. This screwdriver will go through there. Now that's just to give me some leverage, something to hold on in case I have to twist the axle up and down or back and forth. Now this is a 19mm bolt, and I'm going to tell you, I have put enough leverage on this right here to lift the whole back of the bike up off the ground. When these get frozen, it can be a real nightmare. So I don't suggest beating on this, but a good wrench can serve double duty. I have a piece of pipe that I like to use. I've got a big 6-foot piece of pipe I use for an extension. But I know not everybody has a big piece of pipe laying around, but if you have a boxed in wrench and you're careful, and I emphasize careful because it will slip on you, you can actually put it on a wrench and extend your leverage. All right, now I got lucky on this one, but I'm not going to short your video. We're going to go all the way through this, and we're going to talk about all the problems that you can possibly run into. So at this point, we want to verify, will the axle, is it loose? Is it going to come out of the hub? And I'm really not getting any motion outward. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to take my castle nut, and the castle nut has little castle turrets around it, okay? Put it on backwards. Now you may need to clean these threads up. A PB blaster would go a long way. Now when you do this, pay close attention. Take your nut and run it all the way down until it's flush with your axle or bolt, whatever you're working on. Okay? You're gonna make it flush. And what we're gonna do is we are gonna tap this with a hammer, and we're gonna try to push the axle that way to make sure it's not frozen in. I like a little 2.5, 5 pound hammer somewhere in there, some little meat to it. All right, now it moved in, so I got really lucky. So at this point, now you see our axle's trying to turn. And on one side, we have our screwdriver here so I can hold on to it. And on the other side, I'm gonna take this nut back off now. Now before we take it all the way off, we know it's loose and we know it's sliding out. So I'm just gonna tap it. You see I'm not putting a lot of pressure on here. I'm just pushing it all the way out. I do not wanna mess up those threads. That axle's $100 if you had to replace it. So now that we got things moving, I'm going to come back over here to my screwdriver. You can push it all the way through, and then you can walk your axle out. Now I've got my foot underneath the tire here a little bit. I've got the machine jacked up on jack stands or on a table like mine. And then you can sit there and take the tension off of it and pull on the axle. If that doesn't seem to be working, then I recommend taking another pointy screwdriver. Find the pretty much center of your axle and then push it through. Not a lot of pressure, but enough. Now I'm going to stop because most bikes don't come apart this easy and I don't want to short you on this. Knowing what you're dealing with, you've got a spacer right here and you got a bearing, you got a piece of pipe that's inside. We talked about that getting rusted up. It's actually a spacer, piece of tube, and that's what keeps, when you tighten the bolt down, from tightening too tight on the bearings. It catches the inside race of the bearings for the axle, and then the outside of the race goes to the hub. Then you have your brake mechanism on the side over here, and then it passes through the fork again. Now, if you get your nut off, you reverse it, you put it back on, and you tap it with a hammer, and it does not come free, it does not start to slide through like this one did, then what you have is this tube on the inside has rusted solid to the axle. So what you're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to take the forks off the bike. And the reason you take the forks off the bike is so you can get this, work it down to the smallest parts to where you can work with it really. If you can get the nut off and take the forks off, then you can take this fork off and get it out of your way. Then you can come in here and you can take the four bolts off the hub and get the tire out of the way. And then you're only gonna be left with the center hub, the axle, which is locked onto, but you're not going to be able to get it off from this side over here because of this head on this bolt. So that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to tear this down to that point, even though I don't need to, but I'm going to show you what you can do and how you can work around it, where the parts are and how you take them apart. We're going to find a through bolt. And this is a job now. I'm going to tell you, we're committed here. We're going to take at least an hour or so to do this if the axle's locked up. But it's doable and you can do it. It just takes persistence. All right, so here's the bolt that I was referring to. This is our through bolt here. You're going to find one on both sides. Now, if you're working on the big 250 class bikes, that you're going to find two pinch bolts in the top of the triple trees, pretty much in the same location as these. You take both of those bolts out, and what that will allow you to do is to take and spread the triple trees apart. And then the forks will actually fall out. We got a critter living in there. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that our axle is stuck. All right, let's see what I'm doing for y'all. Going all out here. So we're going to take these two through bolts out. I think they're 14 millimeter. While we're here, we can go ahead and disassemble this brake housing. It's also 14 millimeter. Keep an eye on this little retainer here, little barrel with a hole in it. They're real easy to be lost. I'm just going to take the brake cable. I'm going to reassemble it just how it came off the housing, so we don't lose any of the pieces, like so. And you can just tuck it back up out of the way. We won't be needing it for a while. All right, so at this point, this whole front end is ready to just fall right off the front of the bike, believe it or not. But it's been on here for so long, it's just kind of locked up in there. So we're going to give it some persuasion. It's a good idea not to beat on your bike. If you're going to, use a piece of wood. That way it won't mar up your bike too much. That's what's left of the shocks that we talk about. I went ahead and took the two small 12mm bolts off the bottom. I wasn't sure which was going to come out first. Was it going to let go on the bottom or was it let go on the top? A lot of these I take apart, they're broken, they're completely rusted out. They don't have any rebound, and the top and the bottom are two separate pieces. You can see all the dirt and the mud that's collected in these over the years. And this one is actually in really good shape, believe it or not. I know that's hard to believe, but that one's actually got some rebound and the spring is all in one piece. Now you compare that one to this one, and this one did not come loose. And as you see, it's not stretched out either. So at this point, we're still working on the idea that our axle is frozen inside the hub. That's why we're going through all this effort. You don't have to do this to change the tire unless the axle is frozen. Now, you pull it out of the bike just like we've done, and now with the castle nut off, the axle's still frozen, you can take this fork off and you can set it to the side. I take things apart like this. I put it on the right side or the left side of the bike, kind of keep things organized. This is the spacer that we talked about, okay? You would be able to remove that more than likely, maybe not if it's rusted on there too. So, this is our assembly. This is what we have to work with. Each time we get further down this rabbit hole, we get smaller and smaller pieces to work with. So at this point, you could take your wheel and tire off. You could take it to have it, the tire fixed at a tire store. You could bring it back and reassemble it just like we've done. This is the perfect time to replace the bearings in your front axle. So this would be as far as you would need to go if you were just changing the tire. Our tire is loose from our hub now, brake assembly. And at this point you could stop. You could take your tire to the tire store, like I said, and have it repaired. But we're going to go on and we're going to take you through the steps of getting the axle out and replacing the bearings. This is also the perfect time to put brakes on the front. And I know I'm just adding parts here, but this is one of those jobs you really only want to do once. Brakes, you're looking for this bike is about $23 for the front end. Wheel bearings on eBay, on the front ones, you're looking at about 30 bucks. So for $50, you could recondition the whole front end of your bike basically. Roll a lot better, it'll brake a lot better. You're gonna have a new tire up there anyway, you might as well take full advantage of it. Frozen, and I'm gonna show you what that is. So this is our spacer, and that's all it is. If you had a bike that had a speedometer, a lot of people don't know that, but you could get speedometers factory Honda line. You would take this bushing out here, the spacer out, and that's where that mechanism, that drive gear would go. It would actually index and ride on this little square tab that's here built into the hub. It's funny, every bike is actually accessible for that, or possible for that. So what I would do at this point is I would take this over to the press. I know a lot of guys don't have a press, but it's worth $100 axle to go find somebody that does have a press. And the most important thing you do is put the nut back on it. I like to put it on upside down. It is a little trickier when it's a castle nut like that. But that spreads the load out a whole lot better. You're fixing to put this thing in a 20-ton press, and something's got to give. So what you would do, what I would do, is I would take it to a local mechanic shop that has a press, or an uncle or a buddy or somebody that has one, and you would position it inside the press. Now I'm going to tell you that these four little bolts here, I know that's what you want to grab hold to with your press. They're not really that strong. They really aren't. If I would brace it up on this side and push the axle all the way through, because you will bend these flanges and then your tire's going to go down the trail like this because there's no way to get it straight again. So once you were to take this to a shop and ask them to press this axle out, what you would end up doing is they would probably hand it back to you in about 3 pieces. This is your hub. Now these hubs are different. Don't go and just say, oh, I need a hub. The 8 and 9 inch wheels, the hubs are different. The spacing between your forks, left and right, is dictated by the hub, or the hub is dictated by the spacing of the forks. So don't be careful swapping parts out, because they're not all interchangeable. You see these brakes haven't worked in a really long time, but there's a lot of good metal still here. Here it's not thin, it hasn't been rode a whole lot, or it hasn't been worn a whole lot, excuse me. I've even seen these get so bad to where they actually fracture and split, and so that's a bad thing. But what you have in here is you have a bearing that sits behind this rubber seal on both sides, okay? That's the bearing sitting in there, and then between those 2 bearings, there's a piece of tube or a piece of pipe. What you would do is you would press these bearings out, keep the pipe, press the new bearing in, put the pipe in, and then put the opposite side bearing on and capture the pipe inside. It's real straightforward, it's not hard to do. I use the axle, I drop it down in here and I center the pipe up, and then I press that last bearing in, and then I press that last seal in. And then that way everything is nice and aligned. So you have your hub off, it's a good time to clean that up. And then you have your axle. Now this is the other side of your braking mechanism. This is actually your brake shoes. And these shoes have no shoes on them. They're supposed to be an actual piece of pad that sits in there on both sides, and as you see, there's none here. So even if you would have tensioned these brakes up, they were never going to work, because what happens is these shoes, the pad itself breaks loose. It gets really small pieces, and then it just falls out the bottom as you're going down the road. And then you open it up and go, well, how did it didn't have any shoes in it? Well, that's how. But these are spring loaded. If you ever want to know how it works, this is a cam. When you pull the lever, the cable pulls and it opens the cam, and what that cam does is it spreads open the shoes. You see, as this lever turns, the shoes get further apart. Well, they're riding on the inside of that drum, and so when you spread them apart, they start rubbing on the outsides of the drum, and that's where your braking comes from. And so when you adjust them, you're taking the tension. What you're doing is you're taking some of the slop out of this mechanism, and as your shoes wear, then you can increase that tension a little bit more by taking more slop out of them. And then eventually what you do is you'd have to put new shoes in them, which is where this bike is now. As for the axle, in the event that you have a 200 or 200S or a 185S that has the other style front end, and I'm not going to take it apart, but we're going to talk about it so you'll have an understanding of the differences between them. Now this is the much preferred front end. This is a 185S, has an 8-inch wheel as opposed to the 9-inch wheel on the Big Red we just took apart. You could take this entire assembly, the triple trees, the handlebars, the lower triple trees, the forks, the tire, the fender, you can take all of that. One bolt runs right through here basically, and your bearings, you had to replace the bearings. You could take all of this and stick on that other bike, and a lot of people do that, and I've done it too. And that would give you the better front end. This is a more shock style front end like we're used to. It actually cycles and has compression and rebound, as opposed to the other one that's spring actuated. Now, if this is the front end you have the 4 bolts at the bottom that we talked about earlier. You have the same mechanism, the same design really. It's just attached a little bit differently. Loosen these 4 bolts up here on the back side, but do not take them out. Different size bolt, but this is your axle here. It goes all the way through. Just like on the other bike, you have a spacer, you have a hub, you have a dust shield, you have a bearing. Inside that you have the piece of pipe, which is a spacer that we talked about. On the other side, you're going to have the same thing. You're going to have another bearing and another dust shield. And then you're going to have, this is the actual brake mechanism here. You see it works the exact same way. Okay, it's cable operated. Your brake shoes are inside here. Now here's where it gets different. Here, the axle bolt actually goes through the lower fork and is threaded. This is an area for a lot of problems. Here's how you know the difference. If you put a wrench on your axle and you cannot turn it at all, loosen it or tighten it, it's frozen here. If you can turn it but it won't back out, then it's frozen on the inside on that piece of pipe. That spacer that we talked about that's on the inside of the hub. Those are the 2 problem areas on these front ends. Now, if your problem is you can't turn it, then I have taken a torch And I've heated this, but please be careful. This is aluminum. It's not going to turn red. You're not going to know that it's 500 degrees. It's going to look just like this, and it's just going to be as hot as it can be. You will melt this. You will fracture this. Be careful. Spray it down with a lot of lubricant the day before, the night before, an hour before you start to work on it. When you put it back together, use some anti-seize in here. That's a great place for it. So I would heat this up with a torch, and I would get it hot, but not too hot. And then if you have a torch, you know what I'm talking about. And then I would get that bolt out. So if you've got a 185S or a 200S, and your axle is threaded into the right side of the hub, like we showed you on the other bike, take it down this far, take your tire off, take the left side fork off, castle nut and spacer, and get all that out of your way. Then what I want you to do is take this over to a bench vise. And what I did on the last one that I had such a hard time with is I put this in my vise, and I took some of that metal tape. You've seen it before, people use it in air conditioning duct system. And what I made is I made a cup, just taped it around here to where the cup, or the tape stood up just like this, like a little cup. And then I filled that cup with PB Blaster. And I let that PB Blaster sit in there all night. And when I came back the next morning, it had soaked all the way down through the threads. Now, that still didn't fix the problem. But I was able, with it chucked into the vise, I was able to put my 6 foot, 2 inch piece of pipe on it and break it loose. And that was probably the hardest one that I've ever had to do. But that is how you do it. So knowing how it goes together will help you take it apart, whatever you're working on. And so that's why I took the time to show you all the different ways you can do that. And that same process will work on any of the 3 Honda 3-wheelers, from the 185 all the way through the 200s, even to the 250 classes. Here's a 250 Big Red here. It's the exact same thing we were just talking about. This is just like the 200S. You've got the 4 bolts here that pinch the axle, take them loose but not off, allows the axle to turn. The axle goes all the way through, just like we talked about before, and it's threaded into the lower shock boot. If it will not turn, this is your problem area. If it turns but doesn't pull out, then your problem is inside the hub, and that's going to be that piece of pipe. So there's a short little video tonight. Y'all can tell it is hot down here. I think it's 90 at 9 o'clock. So we need to turn the air conditioning on here in the south. It's getting warm this year. And as for this old bike, and I'll tell you about this bike a little bit. This is an 83. I've owned this bike 2 years. I haven't done the thing to it. It's ugly. I drug it out of the corner tonight to show it to y'all. We pull that front tire off and we're gonna fix it. It has no key, no front suspension. The battery in it is the battery that was in it when I got it. It's just a mess. Check this out. I ain't done a thing to it. Nothing. Best bike I got. Kid you not. Okay, maybe not the best bike, but a good one. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. I'll see y'all next week. Y'all take care. Bye.